My name is Samantha Lyneham. I work in the Violence and Exploitation team at the AIC, and within that team I work on human trafficking and slavery research. So today I'm going to be talking through some of the research that we do within the program, specifically the work that we do on human trafficking involving marriage. And I'm going to be using examples from that research to show you how to conduct research on a sensitive topic. So basically what's common to some of those topics is that they involve hidden or hard to reach populations. So what that can mean is that the physical location of the participants may be remote or inaccessible, or it could be because of the hidden location of the crime. For example, we had domestic violence. That's generally considered a hidden crime because it occurs within the home. Another example might be crimes that occur out at sea in international waters, such as trafficking into the Thai fishing industry. It can also involve topics involving persons that actively try to conceal their identity or involvement in crime. It includes drug users, mentally or chronically ill, victims of sexual assault, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer and intersex populations, Indigenous populations, culturally and linguistically diverse populations, illegal, irregular or smuggled migrants, and trafficked persons, which is the group that we're going to be talking about today. So again, what's common to all of these groups is that they are hidden from the point of view of sampling and are therefore difficult to involve in research as participants. What do you think are some of the challenges or considerations that need to be made when trying to research these particular groups? I'm going to be talking about methodological approaches to involving these participants, especially because they are in such hidden locations. The possible stigmatising effect of labelling a participant group, so labelling them as victims. I'm going to talk through targeted sampling strategies to find where the best way is to locate those hidden groups. Issues with gatekeepers and how they can help or hinder your access to participants or information that you need to gather. The validity of participant responses, issues with using interpreters, and participant safety. Okay, so before we get started, we'll just go through some definitions so we're all on the same page. When we talk about human trafficking, we're referring to situations in which a person has been recruited or transported by means of coercion, threat or deception for the purpose of exploitation. That's for adult victims of human trafficking. When we're talking about child victims of human trafficking, you can remove the means element, so the part in blue. So you just need the action and the exploitative purpose. Exploitation can refer to a wide range of situations, but at its core, exploitation results in the loss of a person's freedom. It results in their inability to leave their situation and to cease providing labour or services. So effectively, that person is being held in a situation of slavery. Human trafficking involving marriage and partner migration refers to a situation where marriage or other intimate relationships have been used as the action and exploitation elements of human trafficking. So what that means is that the partner visa system may be used to facilitate the transportation of a person from one country to Australia, or subjects may be exploited to conditions of slavery by their partner once they are in Australia. So for cases of human trafficking involving marriage, the exploitation can include situations of forced marriage, servile marriage, domestic servitude, sexual servitude, forced labour and other similar slavery-like conditions. So in 2011, Dr. Kelly Richards and I began research into how marriage might be involved in the trafficking of people to Australia. The research had several objectives, as you can see here, which were to understand how marriage arrangements are used for the traffic in women to Australia, to explore victim experiences of being trafficked through or for marriage. So we wanted to know how they were recruited and how they were exploited. We wanted to identify the formal and informal help-seeking behaviours employed by these women to exit their situations. And we wanted to assess the implications for government and NGOs in terms of being able to detect and respond to this crime. So as we've discussed, there are a range of challenges that researchers face when attempting to study sensitive topics. There was obviously no exception for this study. And generally, when we're dealing with sensitive topics, they call for methodological approaches that are different from those commonly used for research on more easily observable populations. What methodological approaches do you think you would employ to research a topic such as this one? First, we'll go through more broadly what some design approaches might be. One is to undertake a quantitative design, which usually involves assessing the prevalence, trends and rates of a particular crime. By definition, however, the size of hidden and hard to reach populations is unknown, so it's inevitable that there will be difficulties in quantifying an issue such as this. In relation to human trafficking specifically, there have only been 17 convictions for human trafficking in Australia, and only 214 victims have been referred to the government's support program for trafficked people. So although that might be the tip of the iceberg, there's no doubt issues with trying to analyse such a small sample. The results won't have the validity that we're looking for, they won't be reliable, and you won't be able to generalise the findings. So we'll get rid of that one. As most of you said, we probably need to employ a qualitative design. And the benefits of qualitative research is that it can be exploratory in nature, so it can provide a preliminary insight into an issue, and it can provide a foundation for further study on that issue. It can also be descriptive, so you can understand the nature and context for that crime, you can understand victim experiences, and you can also look at policy and legislative responses that may be needed to prevent or respond to that crime. For our research, we actually used a mixed method design where we incorporated both quantitative and qualitative aspects. The quantitative aspect involved analysing partner visa data that we obtained from the Department of Immigration. And the qualitative aspect looked at, we analysed victim survivor case files, which we accessed through their caseworkers. We interviewed victim survivors, face-to-face interviews, and we conducted interviews with stakeholders from government, NGOs, law enforcement and victim support services. So one limitation of this approach, however, is that research cannot provide a definitive account of the issue. The findings from our report are therefore not generalisable. Instead, we consider the research to be part of an emerging conversation about the different forms of human trafficking in Australia. And although we made no attempt to quantify the issue, this research may be a foundation for others to do so in the future. So one of the first problems that we encountered when we started conducting this research was the possible stigmatising effects of labelling the research participants. In general, labelling can be problematic because the terminology that you apply to a participant group may define the issues that you're talking to them about as specific or within that group. In some cases, the issue may be particular to that group, and that's the reason that you want to talk to them. However, it's likely that the issue is probably a broader one and you just want to see how it affects a particular group. Further, participants may not actually identify with the label that you've given them. For example, we had to be careful about labelling our participants as victims of human trafficking. While some of them were formally identified as victims of human trafficking and were receiving services for people who had been trafficked, others were nominated to participate in the research because their caseworker had, classified their victimisation as human trafficking, or because we had looked through their case file and we made that decision to classify their situation as human trafficking. Therefore, when conducting research on sensitive topics, you should try to limit the use of labelling and try to use softer language when you're dealing with the participant groups. As an example, this is, I hope everyone can see that, this is the plain language statement that we used when we gave to the migrant women that we were speaking to during interviews. As you can see in blue, the very first line says it's a plain language statement for migrant women. We didn't call them trafficked women or trafficking victims. Again, the project activity was conducting interviews with migrant women. And you can see here that we say that we want to understand the role of marriage in exploitation. So again, we're not referring to human trafficking. And our aim was to understand the vulnerabilities and protections to exploitative situations involving women migrating to Australia through marriage. So you can see probably that we have used human trafficking elsewhere, but when we refer to human trafficking, that's in relation to the research project. It's not in relation to the people that we're speaking to. We also referred to the participants as victim survivors in the report. This is because some of the women viewed themselves as victims because that expressed the gravity of the experience that they had been through, while others thought of themselves as survivors because they were more resilient and wanted to show that they had overcome their situation and moved on with their life. So by definition, the location of hidden and hard to reach populations is also unknown and difficult to access. So it's inevitable that there will be difficulties in sampling. Therefore, empirical research projects on sensitive topics should consider a targeted sampling strategy. The benefit of such a strategy is that targeted populations can be found at an accurately defined site, such as special accommodation facilities for trafficked people, brothels for sex workers, police station for detainees, etc. So for our research, we decided on a safe house for trafficked people, as well as domestic violence shelters. This decision was made on the fact that trafficked people will obviously be located at services that are specific to them, but it's also based on the assumption that women who experience violence within relationships would likely seek support from domestic violence services rather than any other type of victim service, including services specifically for trafficking victims. As with any targeted sampling strategy, however, there are obviously limitations. Our sampling strategy inevitably meant that it was likely that all of our victim survivors invited to participate would be female. And although exploitative marriages have been identified as a gendered phenomenon, men can also be the victims of human trafficking involving exploitative marriages and have been identified as such in the UK. So that is a group of victims that we missed out on in this research. This strategy also limited the participants to those who had exited their situation and had made contact with a support service. So it obviously doesn't include women who are still in their situations or women who had exited their situations but had not done so through a support service. What this also meant is that we needed to access participants through gatekeepers. While conducting research on any sensitive topic, it is likely that there will be people that are trying to protect the participants or the data that you need to access. This includes police, caseworkers, service providers, Indigenous elders, etc., whose permission you need to obtain to be able to access the people you want to speak to or the data that you want to access. So there are a number of challenges researchers may face when gaining access through gatekeepers. They may hinder access to participants or data because they're protective of the individuals or the information. This may be an issue with trust, so we need to build rapport with gatekeepers to get their buy-in to be able to conduct a research project. We also aim to diversify our gatekeepers to address any issues of bias. For example, gatekeepers may nominate people who will give a certain perspective, such as only negative experiences or only positive experiences. They may also choose people depending on their own opinions and what they want the outcome of the research to be. And gatekeepers might also choose participants that they think would fit best and provide information they think the researcher wants to hear. So we required the permission of several gatekeepers to access participants for an interview, to also access case files for analysis, and to access immigration data. Accessing immigration data was fairly straightforward. It's administrative data that the Department of Immigration is required to collect systematically and report on it regularly. They're also a government department, so we have a relationship with them where they're able to transfer that information to us quite easily. However, it took us approximately 12 months to get access to victim survivor case files. This is because a memorandum of understanding needed to be developed and agreed upon between us and the people we were getting the case files from. They had to go through legal processes to be sure that everything's okay on their end. And it is quite a lengthy process to de-identify a case file as well, so that took a number of months to be able to give us de-identified data. It then took another 6 months before we were able to interview the people whose case files we had looked at. And this time it took so long because they had to recontact the victim survivors. They had to find a time when both the victim survivor, the caseworker and ourselves were available, and there's usually travel involved in both their end and our end as well. So as sensitive topics are likely to involve participants who actively try to conceal their identity or involvement in crime, we have to be mindful of the validity of their responses to the research questions. Trafficked people may have been involved in stigmatising or illegal behaviour, such as sex work, visa or document fraud, or working illegally. And this leads some people to refuse to cooperate or answer questions, to give unreliable answers, or to give answers that they think you want to hear. It is therefore useful to triangulate information to improve the validity of the research. We did this by building rapport with a participant's caseworker, but it also might be another support person or corrections officer or someone else who's aware of their story and can verify their statements. We also spoke to the participant, looked at their case file, looked at reports from lawyers, looked at police reports, looked at the caseworker's notes, looked at counsellors and psychological reports, as well as speaking to the caseworker themselves. So there are a lot of different ways that we got the same information that could verify the victim's story. Okay, so sensitive or vulnerable populations, especially when you're dealing with populations who don't speak the same language as you, may be susceptible to cultural and linguistic misunderstandings. So interpreters may be needed to mitigate any issues arising from language barriers. Participants may feel more comfortable talking to someone who speaks their language, which is an obvious benefit of using interpreters. However, we also have to be careful about issues arising from the use of interpreters as well. So, for example, participants may be from the same community as the interpreter. The interpreter may know their family, may know their friends. And so the participant may, in fact, feel freer talking to someone who doesn't come from the same community as them, so talking to a stranger. Interpreters may also interpret things differently to how you mean. They may have a different understanding of an issue or may even project their own opinion either to the participant or when they're translating back to you. This unfortunately did happen to us when we were conducting our interviews. Our participants came from the Middle East, Eastern Europe, the Pacific Islands and Southeast Asia, so we obviously offered interpreters to them. One of our interviewees took up the offer of the interpreter just because she was a little bit self-conscious about her English and didn't feel like it was good enough to speak to us, although prior to the interview we were able to communicate with her quite well actually. But that's her decision, so we of course provided an interpreter to her. So we started off the interview by asking the interpreter who was translating over the phone to explain the purpose of the research to the participant. This involved telling the participant that the research was related to human trafficking and exploitation within a relationship. The interpreter then told the participant that we wanted to interview her because of her experiences as a sex slave. We obviously didn't know this at the time because we couldn't understand the language, but it became quite obvious in the participant's face that she became concerned. She didn't want to talk to us anymore. She looked quite upset. So we stopped the interview, put the interpreter on hold. We had a caseworker in the room at the time, so we asked the caseworker to make sure that she was okay while we left the room. The caseworker then came out of the room and sort of explained the situation to us, that she had been referred to as a sex slave, and that's obviously not what she was here to talk to us about. She didn't agree with that term at all. So we asked the caseworker to ask the participant if she was okay continuing in English with us, if she still wanted to speak to us, and because she hadn't had any issues with us prior to the interview, she agreed for us to go back in the room. So we went back in, politely got rid of the interpreter, and then we continued the interview, by clarifying that that's not what we're talking to about. That was, a wrong interpretation, and this is actually what we want to speak to you about. And the caseworker sat next to her and helped her through the interview, and she was totally fine after that. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about today is participant safety. When investigating sensitive topics, there are obviously strong safety concerns for those participants. For trafficked people, their safety is of paramount importance to us as researchers. Often they and their families are threatened with violence and retribution from their offenders, so they're often located in safe houses where they can be hidden and feel safe. Our participants also told us that they have been or would likely be ostracised from their community, and they were at significant risk of honour-based violence. So as I said, some women had to go into hiding, and we spoke to them in those secure locations. So one of the ways that we can protect the participants' safety is by respecting and maintaining their anonymity, their confidentiality and their privacy. We obviously don't use names, we don't use unit-level demographic information or any other information that could identify that person. When we do discuss their characteristics, we do this at the aggregate level. In addition, in this particular report, we use blended case studies to further protect the women's identities. So that involved taking 3 or 4 cases, selecting commonalities out of each of those cases, and then blending them into one general example of the experience of a trafficked person. We would then make up an alias, an age, and a nationality that was unrelated to any of the real cases. When quoting victims, we didn't assign them a number or an identifier, so their stories could not be pieced together throughout the report. You do have to be somewhat careful with this approach, as there's no way for the reader to know, I guess, how truthful you're being with your quotes. You could be presenting quotes that are all from the same person, or just from 2 different people, or it could be multiple different people. The way that we got around this, though, was by saying one victim survivor said this, a second victim survivor said this, while a third agreed with the first victim survivor, for example. All right, I won't go through any of the results today, but if you would like to look up those, you can find the report at the address located on the bottom line of that first dot point. And the second dot point there is just a helpful text when dealing with sensitive populations. That one specifically how to research migration-related issues.